morning, rock stars! Welcome back to String and Story. My name is HollyAnne, and it's my job to guide you to quilt and to live with confidence, and I'm so excited to be here with you guys. Y'all, it has been a doozy of a week. If you might remember, about 9 days ago, Jim got stitches, which his stitches have now fallen out. He's healing up great. And then on Friday, John got in a car accident. He's also fine, but the car is not. And guys, last night Ian dropped a brick on his foot. His toe, specifically. He's gonna be fine. But it's just been one calamity after another. And so I am relieved and delighted to be here with you guys instead and talking about quilting. I'm gonna weirdly tap my screen. I'm gonna see if I can get these colors to look a little bit better. I'm just looking at myself here. I think we're gonna go with it. Okay. I'm gonna try to make this as sharp as possible. Good morning, Nicole, Sandy, Lauren, Winifred, Vicky, Carissa. I haven't seen you in forever. Welcome back, babe. Oh, I'm so glad you guys are here. So we're gonna talk this morning about an introduction to custom quilting. As you know, and if you don't know, big announcement, tomorrow night is Rockstar Status graduation right here at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. And by right here, I actually mean like right there, because I'll probably be sitting down. But you know what I mean. Here on the String and Story page, we have, wait for it, 20 rock stars graduating. My brain is exploding with excitement. It's so wonderful. I'll be sharing their work with you later today and early tomorrow to begin getting you guys excited. I'm so pumped. It's just gonna be a big, wonderful day. I'm sorry whoever's angry about Rockstar Status. I don't think you need to be angry. Just as I noticed that emoji going by. Hey Rhoda, how are you? Other things you should know. The pattern that I'm talking about today as my primary example is Star Island. It's available in my shop. I'm going to make reference to a number of the classes that I offer this morning. There's links to both my shop and my class page down in the caption of this video. There is also a question of the week. I would love to know what free motion quilting motifs or techniques or themes you would love to see videos about in the coming weeks. We have a few weeks to do a few different things as we wait for summer stash busting, which is coming. And then we'll do a lot more free motion quilting on the back end of summer stash busting when we begin to lead into the next Rockstar Status. The plan currently, for those of you who heard about Rockstar Status graduation just a second ago and you're excited and you want to be in the third cohort later this year, the plan right now is Rockstar Status will open for registration again in the fall. I toyed with the idea of doing a spring or summer cohort. I'm just not sure there's enough interest. If you are interested in doing it at any point, please go to the class page and there's a little form there that you can express your interest. And if you just really have a bee in your bonnet for that class to happen sooner, tell me. I'm not totally closed off to it, but the plan right now is that there'll be one more cohort this fall. All right. Anything else? Do make sure you answer that question of the week to be entered to win this lovely bundle. It's just a little bundle of Essex linens and shimmer. I think this was shimmer 1 by Jennifer Sampu. It's mostly Essex linens. I see a couple of shimmers in here. They're charm squares, so they're 5-inch squares, excuse me. Just a fun little bundle that I will send your way. So that's our little prize this week. Ooh, more echoing. So Crystal, you want to see like situations in which I would use echoing and demonstrations of how to do that? Am I hearing that correctly? Hey, Joan. Good morning, good morning. Okay, let's jump in. Now, you'll see as well in the link, there's a link over to my blog that I published for you guys this morning. I'm going to simply be walking through that. And what I'm doing today is breaking down for you guys the process I use when I am free motion quilting, specifically custom quilting, which I do a lot of custom quilting. Let's be honest. That's like my total jam. So Lauren just asked about more overall edge-to-edge designs, and the back of my brain went, really? Are we sure? Do I know edge-to-edge designs? I do. My go-to is custom. Excellent, Crystal. Thank you. So I'm going to break down for you guys how I do this. The extent to which something is customized can vary a little bit. I mentioned in the blog post, I'm using custom quilting here to mean any quilt that you're using 3 or more motifs, right? So that I'll talk about this quilt towards the end. I will probably only use 3 motifs on this quilt, and I would still consider that custom quilting for the purposes of this discussion. Others might call that semi-custom quilting, right? Where every block is the same, the sashing's all the same. I basically respect the seam lines as I'm quilting it, versus over here where I showed no regard for seam lines whatsoever, which y'all can see a little bit of this quilting. I'm gonna play with my light for a hot second and bring this over. I wanna see if I can make it so y'all can see more of this quilting. Let's see if that helped. Maybe a little bit. There are lots and lots of pictures on the blog, so just bear with me as I recognize that on camera, it's hard to see this quilting. Okay, I'll trace it out for you guys, and I may hold it up. I'm a little nervous about taking it off the design wall because chaos might ensue. But there are tons of pictures on the blog that I can offer you guys as illustration, okay? There are two main components of custom quilting, right? The first is, what am I going to quilt where, right? What motifs am I going to use and where am I going to put them on the quilt? So for instance, on this quilt, I have ruler work, I have switchbacks, and then I have various filler designs, feathers, graffiti quilting, etc. Right? So what motifs am I going to use? Where am I going to put them on this quilt? I will probably use 3 motifs. I'm probably going to keep this pretty simple because these sections here, crazy quilting isn't quite the right word. They're very much improv. Some of them are like improv applique. They're done on a foundation muslin, so these sections are thicker. And so I don't want to get too crazy because they're going to be a challenge to quilt through smoothly. So I will probably use 3 motifs. I'll probably do either wishbones, a ribbon candy in the sashing, a single swirl in the block itself, which there's an illustration of that on the blog with a different quilt. And then I will do ruler work in these nice friendly borders because you can see even here on the wall how friendly and wavy these borders are, right? And so ruler work or switchbacks, straight line quilting. If you're on your domestic walking foot quilting, straight lines, it's one of my favorite ways to handle friendly borders, right? Now, oh, Marianne, that sounds fun. Hey, Julie. Oh, how old's grandbaby Julie? Now, these principles that I'm about to talk us through, they are the same whether you're on the long arm or the domestic. It just so happens that I did this quilt on the long arm and I'm also going to do this one on the long arm, okay? But the principles are the same if you're working on your domestic or your long arm. The advantage of working on your domestic is that you can start anywhere, right? When I load a quilt on the long arm, however I load it, I have a top and a bottom at that point, and I have to work top to bottom, side to side. Right? And you have a little bit more freedom to jump around when you're on your domestic if you are so inclined to work in smaller sections, to not have to work in kind of big swaths. For example, on the long arm, if I were to be doing, for Lanterns of Hope. All right, so for the Lanterns of Hope that I made last week, one of our lovely Rockstar graduates did a phenomenal whole cloth quilt with shapes and fills, and I love that idea. And I've seen a few other people do similar things, but I've never explored it, and I decided it's time for me to rise to the challenge and explore it. And that's what I want to do on Lanterns of Hope. But if any of those shapes kind of cross over where that quilt is positioned on the long arm, that's a lot trickier to deal with, right? Because I have this kind of window I have to work in. The advantage being on your domestic is you don't have that. You can pivot and move the quilt along. You can jump from one section to another as often as you like, right? Now, the challenge of that freedom is you want to make sure your quilt is well basted or you'll end up with puckers and extra fabric in the back. Please see homemade spray-based recipe. If you're not familiar with the homemade spray-based recipe, click through any of these links over to my website and you'll see a search bar. Just type in homemade spray-based and there's a couple of blog posts about it that will come up for you, okay? So again, same principles apply. You just have a little bit more freedom of movement on the domestic. Oh my goodness, 8 months. That's such a fun age. Yes. Nicole, I love that idea. That is a great plan. I will add that to my list. I've been thinking about that a bit lately. Which, do I have? I probably have a quilt I could do on my domestic and do some walking foot. All right, so when you're getting started, you've made your quilting plan. You've decided what motifs you're using and where they're going. Right, I recommend, I'm looking to see if my notebook is over here. I do have a notebook over here that I can use to show you. I recommend actually drawing out that quilting plan on paper on purpose before we get started, right? It could be, if you're doing everything similarly in one block, it might look like that. If you're drawing If anyone recognizes that star, it's from the center of the Moda Bake Shop quilt last year, right? So actually drawing out your quilt and doing different quilting plans. Draw out where you're gonna stitch and have it planned ahead of time. This is a very custom quilt that I did last spring, all right? Now, if you have questions about that section, I recommend my beginner free motion quilting class as a place to get started with 10 foundational free motion quilting motifs. And I recommend how to make a quilting plan. How to make a quilting plan takes those 10 motifs and several others and walks you through the different shapes that frequently appear in quilts. Circles, triangles, squares, sashings, borders, blocks, grid style quilts, right? And talks through what kinds of motifs work well in those shapes, so you have kind of some back pocket ideas of like, let me start with this kind of basic idea and I can build on that or change it as I so desire, right? So those are the two classes I recommend if you have questions about the first section, what to quilt and where to quilt it. But then the question becomes how? How do I break this big thing into bite-sized pieces? Right? And that's what I want to step us through. The first step, whether you're on your domestic or on your long arm, is to actually secure together the layers of your quilt, right? If you're working on your domestic, this one, you can't really see the basting anymore because I think all the pins are out. But if you're working on your domestic, even if you've spray basted and even if that's pretty secure, right? It's not as secure as getting actual needle and thread through your quilt, because then you will know that it can only shift so much. Right? Same thing on the long arm. I float my tops. So when I load a quilt on the long arm, it literally is just sitting there when I get started. And the only part that is actually connected to the backing and the batting is whatever has been stitched through. So the most common way to secure this is by stitching in the ditch between all your blocks, right? So a basic grid down your long arm or running it under your machine. And you can do that with a regular piecing foot. Or a walking foot if you're on your home machine. On your long arm, of course, it's going to be either a free motion foot or a ruler foot, and I recommend making use of channel locks if you have them, or of a good ruler to help guide you. Which, guys, we've been talking about this ruler a lot lately, and I found an Amazon link to it. So if you've been interested in Natalia Bonner's 4-in-1 ruler, you can actually get it through an Amazon link at the top of this week's blog. Just sidebar. Now, full disclosure about stitching in the ditch. I'm still learning about the actual value of stitching in the ditch. It takes time. I'm not known for being the most patient person, but as I'm doing more and more complex quilting, I'm seeing the value of making sure my quilt is very secure, and I can see the difference in the smoothness of my overall quilting and the finished product when I take the time to make sure the quilt is secure first. Now, this particular quilt, because I really wanted these curves to show, and for example, you can see here the ditch falls right in the middle of the curve, and I didn't want a break in the puff. I actually used this large scallop design to secure the quilt. So you'll see a picture on the blog where the first thing I did is just this outer scallop all the way down the quilt, right? So my quilt top is now secured. My backing, my batting, and my top are technically a quilt at this point, right? It's not super well quilted. I wouldn't recommend pulling it off and binding it at this point because your batting will shift over time, but things are put together. The next step is any motifs you have to do that are going to add to the structure of your quilting. These are things that are your visual reference points, right? If you're doing something, if I were doing like shapes on this one, like I was telling you I want to do for Lanterns of Hope, you know, I would stitch in the ditch and then I would make sure all those shapes are outlined. Right? If I was going to be doing some big feather thing down the middle of this that everything else had to happen in relation to the feather, I would do the big feather first, okay? In the case of this particular quilt, my next step for my kind of visual reference was to go in and do the second echo of the kind of clamshell arc. And then also there's actually spines here that mimic, I don't think I have any of the fabric super handy, but if you've seen Matthew's Aura fabric up close, then you'll know that there is like a palm shape in this cream fabric. And so I was mimicking that palm shape in each of the clams, right? So first step, secure the quilt. Second step, anything that requires solid visual reference points. This is your larger motifs, typically, right? On this quilt over here, my next step, depending on how I'm going to quilt it, would be to do the sashing, right? Now, this particular quilt, I will actually quilt the whole thing top to bottom and do the blocks and sashing at the same time, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But again, if I were, say, doing custom quilting in each of these blocks and every block was going to be different, and I was planning on breaking thread for each block anyway, my next step would be the sashing, okay? Speaking of, you've probably already picked up on the fact that custom quilting involves a couple of things. It involves more time. Often involves more practice and planning, but it involves more time. It is going to use more thread. I used a lot of thread, especially on this quilt. And there are more thread breaks, right? It kind of comes with the territory. Now, this guy, as I went along with it, I got to the point where I could move through a clamshell and then travel into the next one for adding the fillers, right? But the ruler work of all of these arches and the lines, all of that, there were thread breaks. I just buried them as I went. Is it my favorite thing? No, it's not my favorite thing. But the final effect, hashtag worth it, right? All right, so we have our quilt secured. We have our big visual reference points done. The next to last step, or possibly last step, depending on your quilt, is to put your fillers in. Hey, Lydia! Ooh, more feather varieties. That sounds fun to me, Lydia. I also like that idea we were kicking around last night of different thread weights, because I need more practice with thread weights. I got to think about that. Doing your fillers is going to be your final step. This is the detail work. This is the pebbles, the paisleys. These are the little details that just make the quilt zing, right? If you look at the pictures on the blog, if I had stopped when I had just done the ruler work and not added the fillers to this quilt, it would have been very boring, right? Like the quilting would not have been interesting to look at, right? And the quilt, because it's gorgeous fabric and it's a nice big star, would have been nice, right? But to me, part of the reason I'm obsessed with custom quilting is I really like the additional layer of design that happens when you free motion quilt and get really custom with it. It adds a whole nother thing, right? This is why we have things like the Impressionist movement or pointillism in painting, or even super realism, right? Because the brush strokes themselves with those types of painting matter, right? With super realism, the fact that you can't see the brush strokes matters. With Impressionism, the fact that you very much can see the brush strokes and there is excess paint, excess, it's obviously all a choice, excess paint, you can see where the bristles were and how they moved and literally the way the artist moved his or her hand in order to get that effect. Pointillism, the fact that everything's made up of tiny little dots, right? All of these in painting add an extra dimension to the work of art itself. And in quilting, we have the option to do that with our stitching, right? Which is very cool. One of the things that's very cool about quilting is it's both a 2D art and a 3D art, right? We have a lot of blending going on there, which is totally fascinating and exciting. Hey, Terry! All right, now your final step at this point, you've secured your quilt, you've done your big, kind of most visually impactful motifs, right? And then you've added your details, the little notes that make it sing. The final step, if you have one, would be to quilt your border. I always do my borders last. I find this particularly important in two situations, right? If you're quilting on your domestic, I want you to quilt your borders last because if, as you are quilting, any extra fabric comes out of these seams or whatever, and this can happen very early on, even if you're stitching in the ditch, you may just, as you're smoothing it to quilt, end up with extra fabric out here, right? This also matters if you already have borders that you know are friendly, like this little beauty that I'm quilting for my uncle, right? And the reason for that is you have a lot more control over what's going on there if everything else is secure and you're simply moving the excess out to the edge, right, whenever possible. Now, for this particular quilt, like I said, this will be straight line quilting because I can almost guarantee that there will be a pucker somewhere in this. But if I have all this quilted nice and smooth and then I have this little bit of extra fabric, which y'all can just barely see, if I have to put a little pleat in here, I can put that pleat where I know a straight line of stitching is going to hit right at the edge. And especially once it's washed, it'll be basically invisible, right? That happens sometimes. It's good to have a trick in your back pocket to pull out if your borders get a little friendly, okay, that is not, oh shoot, now that the rest of it's quilted, I have to figure out how to take the borders off and put them back on, not wavy, right? So I will be handling these last and treating them special. Other motifs that can be really good for kind of using up extra fabric, or denser motifs, things like feathers, can be really good as well. You just have to make sure that you're kind of massaging the ease and not just shoving it out of the way, so you end up with a big crease up here in your feather. Oh, you can't even see that. Big crease up here in your feather, right? Now, this particular quilt, I want to talk you guys through this. Some people would call it more semi-custom. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm still referring this as custom quilting because we're using 3 or more motifs. But I want to talk to you about how I'm going to quilt this top without thread breaks, okay? So in the case of this one, I will do at least some stitching in the ditch, probably just on the horizontal, which I'm going to load it this way because, as you can see, this row is actually slightly offset from the others. So I will load this horizontally, and so I can stitch in the ditch long ways because all of those are lined up, and secure everything and secure this sweet little wonky quilt to be as square as she possibly can. Hey, Robin! Then I will do my sashings and my blocks in one go, right? So in this orientation, the way I would do that, I'll start here so you can see, is I would come down in my sashing and quilt that to the corner, making sure I end in this corner. I will do a big swirl in the center of the block, and I will end at the top corner. And then I will go down in my sashing, and I will make sure I end at this corner, which, because these are offset, I would have to probably travel slightly, but you know. Same thing, swirl, end in the top corner. And I would continue that all the way to the end, and then I would do my center sashing all the way back, and start the process again. Down, block, into the top. Down, block, into the top. You could do this with more than just swirls, right? You could do this with any, hey Jenny, you can see the pictures are going to be clearer than anything that's going to show up on camera here, unfortunately, for the long arming on this. There's a lot. I'll hold it up at the end. Once I pull it off the wall, it'll be off. So, but you could use this same principle with any motif. In these blocks. The key is that you start in the bottom corner, the bottom left corner, and you end in the top right corner, so you can travel down and quilt the sashing at the same time, right? So I will work, and I'll be working long rows, but same basic idea. I'll be working back and forth all the way down this quilt down to the bottom. Right now, if you were on your domestic, you could then theoretically just jump over into the borders and quilt the border and do the whole thing without breaking thread. Right, because I will be on my long arm, I will likely break thread and roll it back to the top and start at the top and work my way around on the borders. But that's a perfect stepping stone into the world of custom quilting, is just to simply do a quilt that's on a grid, a very traditional layout, using just 3 motifs, right? And then you can work your way towards doing something where you completely ignore the seam lines. This is where a lot of my experimenting is right now, is what happens when I ignore seam lines and I impose an entirely different design on top of the quilt. So there really are layers of depth there, not just adding texture to the existing layers, right? Thank you, Robin. Any questions, guys, before I pull this big old thing off the wall and share it with you? I will hold it up so you can see a little bit more. I just wanted to wait till the end. And there are lots of pictures on the blog. But what other questions do you have about custom quilting and about how to break this down into bite-sized pieces? It really is about taking it a step at a time, right? That was unpleasant. Sorry for the weird water bottle sound effects. For the longest time, I felt like custom quilting was impossible until I started to be able to see how it's just like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Right? How do you custom quilt anything one bite at a time? Hey, Deborah! All right, I'm going to pull this puppy down. Wish me luck. Woo! Okay. And we'll adjust the light and everything so that y'all will be able to see. Oh, Marianne, that's a great question. So I talk more heavily about that in How to Make a Quilting Plan, because it talks about deciding what shapes you want to emphasize. A lot of it just comes with practice, and that's part of what I love about this technique that I was talking to you guys about, is it doesn't create a whole lot of different layers, but it just starts getting your eyeball seeing the different sections of the quilt as different entities. And you can choose, like you could choose to do something much denser in the sashing to play with the blocks popping, right? And just start to play around with that and see what you like, right? In this case, what I really wanted to emphasize was that scallop shape, which y'all can kind of see. Here, let me show you the back because you'll be able to see more of the quilting on the back. There you go. Ta-da! So I really wanted that scallop shape, which as I mentioned, it exists in this fabric. Let's see if I can get this where y'all can see. Can y'all see that in that fabric? Right here. So I wanted to take that scallop fan shape and recreate that in the quilting with just like total disregard for the stars, right? Like this is one of those instances where I was creating a thing to pop rather than going with something that was already there, okay? And then I created, so y'all got to see the pizza pan video, and if you missed the pizza pan video, there's a link in today's blog post because I really enjoyed quilting with pizza pan, that's why. I thought I had great entertainment value too, for what that's worth. And then you can see I created the spine, so I did this second echo. And then I used my 4-in-1 ruler to create a straight line down the bottom and these swoops, right? So there's 2 sets of swoops in each scallop. And then I alternated curvy fill designs and switchbacks. Okay. We could be here all day with me just like showing you guys different variations on this. Because each one is different. I made this up as I went along. Okay, and guys, this is the thing that this is what I want you guys to understand from today, is it looks complicated. It looks really complicated. It's not that complicated, right? It's a one step at a time deal. Right, so even this guy, I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to quilt it. I actually put it on the long arm. I just didn't baste it to the long arm. And I just was like, I'm just going to let it sit there and look at it, right? And so if you're having trouble deciding what should pop, look for what's your favorite fabric in that quilt, or where did your points turn out real fine, right? Was there a star in the center of something that like your points were perfect every time? Like emphasize that, right? Maybe leave it unquilted, maybe echo around it. There's a couple of different ways you can do that. Again, I talk about this a lot more extensively in how to make a quilting plan, right? And then you just take it one layer at a time and you build it up, all right? So it looks more challenging than it is. The first time is the most challenging. And then you just keep building those skills. Every single one of you can do this. Just like all of you can graduate from rockstar status, right? There's 20 of you graduating tomorrow night that I remember when you got started and you weren't sure, right? And look at you now, right? You did amazing work in this class. And what did it come down to? It came down to practice and taking it one step at a time, right? It's the same thing with anything in free motion quilting, okay? So there's all of that. And the front, which it's a lot harder to see in this light. Like I said, pictures on the blog. All right, any last questions, my dears? Try this with a baby quilt. For those of you who have had an opportunity to take either rockstar status or beginner free motion quilting, or you've got, you know, a handful or two of free motion motifs under your belt, piece together a quick and dirty baby quilt. Right? Like 10-inch squares. Like grab yourself a layer cake that you're like, shoot, what am I going to do with this? And just try this idea, right? Just with something like a layer cake, there aren't a lot of seam lines to either have to bump over or to have to figure out what am I doing with the rest of this quilt, right? And just what shape do you want to be there? And then make it with your stitching, right? Like trace household objects, like get creative, get fun, get yourself a pizza pan. Be careful if you get yourself a pizza pan, please. No injuries, It's not an official quilting tool. See all the previous disclosures, right? Or disclaimers. But I challenge you, if this is something you're curious about, just to dive in and give it a shot, right? Because that's the only way to get going with this, is to see what can you do and to take it one step at a time. All right? Let's see. Katie, what'd you say? That's right, Katie. Okay, so Katie's graduating tomorrow night with 19 of her cohort mates. And you can do anything, right? All right. I'm so proud of you guys and the work that many of you, especially my upcoming Rockstar graduates, have been doing on your free motion quilting. I hope this is an exciting topic for you. And listen, here's the thing. If you watch this and you're like, but I've tried free motion quilting and it's not my jam, but I love the look of that, please remember that I am taking custom quilting long arm clients right now. So if you're like, I want that look, but like that is not my heart's desire. My heart's desire is just a piece, and for someone else to do my quilting, I can help you with that too. And we'll use these principles to plan the quilting on your quilt together instead, okay? Have an absolute wonderful Thursday, guys. I will see you back here on the String and Story page tomorrow night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern for Rockstar graduation. Yay! And we will celebrate 20 of you who have been putting in extra effort on your free motion quilting. I hope all of you will be inspired to try something new this weekend, and I will talk to you guys soon. Mwah!